Are you struggling to create an intentional headspace? Unable to connect deeper with yourself? Come, and together, let's address the elephant in the room. I'm your host, Sinead Roche, and this is the Uncomfortable Podcast. If you're someone who goes out of their way for people, and you help others, and you're often really considerate about people, even sometimes when it inconveniences you, like what I mean by this, for example, is there's been times in my life where I'm busy, but like I'm seeing that other people are sick, so I want to take care of them. Or I hear that one of my friends wants something very specific, so if I see it, like I automatically just get it for another person, like, cause in my mind, it's just like, it makes sense to do that. And I know it's going to make them happy, and that in turn will also make me really happy. And it's like kind of nice that I'm able to give something to another person. When you're that type of person, and it doesn't just have to be those types of examples, it could be even like, helping a stranger out. Like if they just dropped a pen for instance, like not everyone needs to pick up the pen, and it might be talking to very specific people today. But it's just kind of those small instances where it's like you go out of your way for other people. And sometimes you would consider yourself, or like, not sometimes, but you might consider yourself to be very generous and very kind and giving person. I think that you're going to realize though, like, especially when you do this often enough, you might realize that those efforts are not being reciprocated sometimes, and that energy is not being reciprocated all the time. And, in some cases, especially when it comes to like strangers, it's not like, if you help that person in one instance, like 5 minutes later, they had the opportunity to help you, that you're going to go and yell at them and be like, why didn't you do this? It's not like you're going to confront them at that point, because just because you saw the opportunity to help someone because you took it doesn't mean that they're going to do that, especially in like a stranger's incident. I mean, maybe it will happen. Maybe they will help you, but sometimes that's not necessarily the case. And in other places that we might feel that our energies and like our generosity isn't being reciprocated is with relations with certain people. And it might make us feel like we're overdoing it constantly, that we're doing so much and putting so much effort in, and it's just not being reciprocated. And sometimes a talk will help with matching those efforts, but that's not always going to be 100% the case, because sometimes people, they just don't have it in them to match that effort in the way you do it. Sometimes they might also do it in different ways that you didn't notice before. They might show their care and their love for you in a different manner, and that's completely okay. Having that conversation though definitely does help to understand, like, okay, this person does still care for me, or like I'm not overdoing it, especially if you need that reassurance, which is not a bad thing at all. And there's other reasons also why a person, like in relationships, like they might not be able to match our energy in the same way. For instance, they could be going through a low point in their life and you might not know it. And without, those conversations, sometimes we don't figure that out, and we take it really personally that people aren't, showing up for us in the way that we show up for them, But there's also many other different reasons, because, the way people care and the way people show, and whether or not they're a generous person, whether or not they're a quote unquote kind person, that's very different, person to person. And also, depending on what past experiences they've had, like maybe it takes them time to show this generosity or to show this care. It's just very dependent on the person, But something I've realized about myself in being a kind or generous person, and normally I wouldn't say that about myself. I think it's taken me really a lot of time to look at myself and be like, okay, like, and be able to like confidently say like, I'm actually a really kind person. I'm actually a really generous person. Like I've seen myself give so much to others. Or like, I don't know, like I like making those small efforts. But something that I've realized recently is that I have stopped seeing like my efforts as a good thing. And I've seen it myself, seeing them as like something that I'm overdoing a lot of the times. And I get really, really resentful because it feels like people sometimes aren't reciprocating the energy back to me, and the efforts aren't being matched, And then I start looking at things that I do and I'm like, okay, but I did this for you. So that means you're going to do something for me, right? You know? And the problem with that thinking is that's no longer being a generous and kind person. And that's me trying to see things in a black and white manner where it's like, just because I do something for you, like I'm expecting it to be returned back to me in some way or another, shape or form. And that's not being a kind or a generous person. And, communication is clearly necessary in those moments when I feel like I'm overdoing it and people maybe might not be showing up for me in the same manner, But other reasons why like this becomes like really, really bad is that if you are with a thinking that you are a good person, one thing that I've started to realize is that good people, you don't do things because you expect something in return. Because when you do something and you expect something in return, it's no longer a good thing with a good intention. That's just manipulation. That's you trying to hold something over another person. That's you, for instance, saying to someone like, hey, like I cleaned this up, like now you owe me one. Like, but that's not what good intentions are. And I talk a lot about on this podcast about like becoming like a better version of yourself, but I also want to become like just a better person in general. And in keeping with this, like that also means building my own character for myself, and not because I think it's going to get me something, like, because in most cases, when you become like the bigger person, or when you become a kinder person or a more genuine and generous person to people, like that might not always guarantee that something good comes back at you from those specific people. And that's very okay. That's very normal. But something I've realized, I keep saying I've realized, but like something I'm starting to really understand is that being a good and kind and generous person is rarely going to be rewarded. And you need to understand that when you make the decision to do something that's generous or kind for another person, you are not doing it for them. You have to do that stuff for yourself. Being a kind person, making that decision, like to be nice to people, that's not for others. That's not so that others can see you in a better light. That's not so that others can start liking you. That's for your own character. And I think, the more events I experience in my life where it's just like heartbreak, tragedy, betrayal, loss and grief, the more I realize that like you could it's so easy to become a bad person. It's so easy to become such a jaded person. And so when I think about like staying a good person and really being a good person, even through hard times and even after you've learned some lessons, like in a really harsh manner, I know that like people who are like that shit is hard. They are disciplined people. And that's something I really admire now that I've gone into the thinking more of it. Like I really admire kind and genuine people, because everyone goes through tough situations in life, regardless of what extreme it might be. Everyone goes through tough situations in life. And it's people who are sticking to this narrative that like, I'm still going to be a good person. The amount of discipline that takes is insane. And, again, I would like to improve as a person. And that's something I've had to, I guess, really confront with myself and ask myself like, hey, do I want to be that type of person? Do I want to remain a kind and generous person? Do I want to do that? Like, even when the energy might not be reciprocated, even when it's not giving me something in return. And so before you continue throughout this episode, and I don't know how long we're going to be here, but ask yourself, what type of kind person do you want to be? I think that's genuinely where it starts, and when you answer that question for yourself, like also realize, okay, why you want to be kind, because I've heard myself tell myself that like I want to be kind because like then people are gonna like me. Like I've heard myself say that shit. And now I'm at that point where it's just like I want to be kind because I know that's gonna sit right with me. I know that when I do certain actions, it's going to sit right with me, and it's not about how other people are necessarily going to give back to me. But because I've had so many not so many bad experiences, but because I have like past experiences with like resentment attached to like doing so much and going overboard with people, like I also have to be very careful of how I go about this, which we will get into in a moment. But yeah, this episode really is just like understanding that being kind is for you. You do it for yourself, because at the end of the day, like you are with yourself 24/7. And I like knowing the fact that I'm kind, especially because I think it makes me feel like if I'm kind, then perhaps there's other kind people outside of me. And I think it helps me to have definitely a more positive outlook on life. So yes, that's why I want to be kind. But how do we get there? You know, how do we go through this, and how do we like kind of overcome like those past feelings of, for instance, like resentment, or the past feelings of like you're doing too much? How do we still remain genuine and generous to other people, even though in the past that has not necessarily been reciprocated, and hasn't made us feel really good about ourselves? First of all, why are we always like looking for people to reciprocate our energy back to us and our efforts back to us? I mean, it makes sense 100%. Like, it's not like you want to just be showing up, the only one who's showing up in your relationships and stuff like this. But I think a bigger part of it is the fact that we don't validate ourselves enough, you know, and we are looking for other people to validate us. And the people who we are choosing to get that validation from, perhaps we idolize them. And so for us, like getting their approval means so much more to us than getting our own approval of ourselves. And so we kind of attach this like them potentially reciprocating with our own sense of worth and sense of value. And I've mentioned this so many times in different episodes where I say like that's actually extremely dangerous to do. And it's also making your relationship really transactional. And I don't want my relationships to be transactional. And so even when it's hard, like I really do have to ask myself, like when I'm doing certain things, like, hey, like, am I doing it because it's going to make me feel good? Or am I like waiting for the approval of others, you know, so that they realize, oh, I'm a good person, or maybe then they'll like me in that sense. So that's something that I've realized I'm like having to work on and validate myself more, like for doing the actions because I want to do the actions and not because of their reactions. You know, I said it even in the beginning of this episode, how like I'll buy something like for a person if they said they wanted it, because it's gonna I know it's gonna make them happy and that's gonna make me happy, you know. But sometimes, and that's nice, you know, that's really nice being able to make people happy. But I also have to ask myself, like, initially, is that going to make me happy? Like, am I going to be excited also to give this person this thing to this person, regardless of what the reaction is going to be? That might be a bit confusing to understand, but I just don't want it to be tied to the fact that they might now look at me in a higher way or approve of me more. You know, it has to be the fact that I am approving of myself before I even do this for another person. Then another reason why like we could have bad experiences, like, and might restrict ourselves from being who we are and quote unquote overdoing it with people, is that we see being good as automatically getting a reward. And I've mentioned this already, that like being good is not about getting something back. It's about your own character, your own discipline, and remaining true to yourself. You know, I see so many posts about like the things of like, okay, match people's energies, or, you know, show up the way you would want to show up for people, like without necessarily expecting that back. And I started to change my thoughts of like, okay, match the energy that is showing with, just also like show up in the way that you wanted to show up initially, because I think it also damages a part of you when you have to restrict yourself so much to the point where it's like, you don't know if this is like, are you able to do this? Am I able to give you this? Am I able to be like kind to you in this way? Like, am I overdoing it? But again, when you're talking about that in the context of relationships, that's always important to have a conversation with, what the person likes and what the person doesn't, so much, because that also changes that. It just changes how that's going to be done in some sense. And then another thing that I realized that leads people like myself to have bad experiences with this is the fact that sometimes we don't have healthy boundaries on the way we are kind and generous to people. I saw this thing about like, I'm a kind person, but I'm not too nice. And what I think they meant by that is that they are still generous, still, giving and kind and genuine, but there's boundaries with it. There's stopping themselves from doing, like, I don't want to say doing too much, but not allowing themselves to get taken advantage of, because that's also something that people who, if they're giving so much constantly, like, then other people can see that and be like, oh, this person might be actually stupid, and take advantage of that. And so in that sense, it's also asking yourselves like, okay, like, am I even overstepping my own boundaries with this, just because, again, for instance, you're seeking approval of another person, or perhaps sometimes it's just like, it's been in your nature to give so much that you don't even realize that you don't even like it, that it makes you perhaps dislike yourself. Because there's been even times where I've done stuff and I'm just like, why the fuck did I actually do that? Like, I didn't even like the act that was going on. Like, I didn't even like that act of generosity like that I was doing. And it wasn't even a compromise. It was just me stepping over my own personal line. And I didn't even appreciate that about myself. So it's also taking that time to reflect, like, okay, do I have healthy boundaries on the way that I'm kind and giving to people? And then another thing that I've started to realize is that, again, like this thing of seeking validation from others, like when they then like reciprocate it, is that we might not initially be kind to ourselves. And so we're always looking for other people then to show up for the way that we need to actually be showing up for ourselves. And that's something I've also had to reflect on and correct. I would say correct in that sense. Like the other day, I had like a meeting, I think at like 10, and it was 9:40. And I wanted this very specific coffee. I love coffee. And I wanted this very specific coffee. And, for friends, I've done this thing where I will literally inconvenience myself and go somewhere to get something for them, even if I'm sprinting around and I'm like in a panic mode and everything like this. But I would never do that for myself. And so I literally made the decision. I was like, at 9:41, I was like, let me just go. Let me just go and get this. So I went. I made an inconvenience for myself. I was kind to myself in that sense that like I did something for me. Like I was being kind initially to me in a way that I've also been for other people. And it's kind of also like redirecting like all that generosity and that kindness. Like you also have to put it back into yourself. And it's going with that metaphor of like, you need to fill your own cup before you can fill others' cups. Otherwise, you're just emptying yourself. And that is something that's really unusual and uncomfortable for me, just because sometimes it doesn't feel as good as when another person like takes the initiative to do it and to be kind to me. Like, but I know the more I do it, the easier it's going to get, the less uncomfortable it's going to feel. And I love the fact that there's so much intention behind it, because I know that there's also so much intention behind my kindness when I'm kind to others. So yes, I think that's just be kind. Be kind. And I guess the question I want you to be asking yourself, if you have this tendency to perhaps go overboard with people, or to always be giving all your efforts and everywhere, is to ask yourself before every single action that you do, that like where you're trying to show effort, like ask yourself, will this make me happy without their reaction? Will this make me happy without their reaction? Because there's been times where I've asked myself that question. I'm just like, no, it won't. Like, no, it won't. So let me not do this. Because when you also engage in certain acts, obviously there's compromise, but like when you engage in certain acts where it's like you're already setting yourself up for disappointment by the fact that they're not going to reciprocate that, then you're also doing damage to that relationship that was not needed. And again, it's putting another healthy boundary on yourself, and to make that relationship kind of healthier, because then you don't kind of make them unknowingly accumulate this debt that they don't owe to you, but that you think they owe to you. So yes, I would ask that for people who have the tendency to be really kind and generous to others. Ask yourself though, like if you notice that in the past times, like it's not being reciprocated, like are the things that you're about to do for other people specifically, like are they going to make you happy without their reaction? Because if you're just doing it for other people, then you're not really being kind. Because as we know now, being kind is all about your own character and is all about being disciplined for yourself. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode. Hey guys, thank you so much for supporting this week's episode of The Uncomfortable Podcast. Make sure to tune in every Monday for a new episode on Spotify and YouTube, and go check out our TikTok and Instagram for more content.